Thanks to the internet, I can look at the cover of every Marvel and DC comic book that was released on a weekly basis in my lifetime. And, before my memory completely fades away, I'd like to take this little trip down memory lane. You see, we had these comics in the house in the 70s, which was before I could read. For DC, we had Stacked Cards, which was a comic with a record inside. I got mine signed by Neil Adams. And we had the Secret Origins of the DC superheroes, reprint, trade paperback, all their origin stories and what have you. For Marvel, we had these paperback books, digest size reprints of the original Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko artwork stories, all written by Stan Lee. My dad printed these at work, as well as the Hulk magazines from the TV show, of course, these issues here. And I have covered all of these in previous videos. That brings us to Christmas of 1980. Now I could read. I got my first comic book, The Pink Panther, issue 78. My brother got Little Planets, issue 10. I've covered these in a previous video as well. And then it would take until February of 1981 for me to get my next comic book. It was my first superhero comic book. Here it is, The Amazing Spider-Man, issue 216. It was in June of that year that I met my best friend Mike. He showed me his Clash of the Titans drawing in that same month. I've talked about this in my previous videos about how it got me to start drawing, eventually wanting to draw comic books for a living. Then in November of that year, my brother and I got our next comic book, Star Wars issue 56. This ends on a cliffhanger, and here it is 43 years later. I still don't know how it gets resolved. Then a week before my 8th birthday in April of 1982, my brother got this issue of The Avengers 221. Then at the end of that summer, my mom sent off for some comic book subscriptions for us, and they started arriving in the mailbox in September. We got Incredible Hulk 278, 279, and 280, The Amazing Spider-Man 236, 237, and 238, and Star Wars issues 66, 67, and 68. Look up this one on eBay. It's pretty expensive now. For that matter, so was this first appearance of Hobgoblin. As the comics came in, we must have got pretty excited because my mom ordered another round of subscriptions, but because of the little delay between the subscriptions, there's a little gap in our run of issues. So instead of having issue 239, we go to 240, 241, 242 of The Amazing Spider-Man, and somehow we also got 243. I think the comics started going bi-monthly, so that's why we got an extra issue. We missed issue 69 and 70 of Star Wars and started up with 71, 72, and 73. And instead of getting another subscription to The Incredible Hulk, we got a 6-month subscription to G.I. Joe, issue 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. 11 was my personal favorite as a kid. I read this about 100 times. In fact, this is not the original. The original was so trashed and demolished, every page crumpled into a tiny bit and torn to shreds. This is a replacement copy. I don't know why we didn't get more subscriptions after that. I mean, we loved those comics, but we only got 2 more in that entire year. In mid-October of 1980, my brother got I got the Fantastic Four issue 262. My brother got Iron Man 178, probably picked up at 7-Eleven by my dad. This comic, even though it was my brother's, became my favorite because of the story in the back about the little kid Avengers. I would go on to collect every Assistant Editor's Month comic, which came out this month because they were all kind of weird stories. And the little kid Avengers actually came back in a sequel comic at some point, and I got that as well. My brother gifted this comic to me for my birthday one year because I just kept reading it all the time and it was his, but now it's mine. Then for Christmas of 1983, we got the Dungeons & Dragons Basic Rule box set. Now we could play the game for real. We have been dabbling with it since 1981 through different friends, through the Dungeon board game, what have you, various unofficial versions of the game. Now we've got it for real and we were off and running. Now the next year, in March of 1984, standing in the checkout line at Publix with my dad, just on a whim while he was paying for the groceries, I asked if I could get this. Mad Magazine issue 245, my first issue of the magazine. It launched a whole new collection, which I'll show in another video. Then in June, we got G.I. Joe 27, the Uncanny X-Men 185, 135, and Marvel Team Up, Spider-Man and Iron Man, issue 145. And in October, on my brother's 12th birthday, we got the Uncanny X-Men 189. Then the next year, in April of 1985, for my 11th birthday, I got this 3-pack of G.I. Joe comics that came in a baggie at Toys R Us, G.I. Joe issues 36, 37, and 38. And I also got The Amazing Spider-Man issue 267. In June, we got Fantastic Four 282, and July, we got The Amazing Spider-Man 269. And there it was. This stack of comics. My brother and I, we had a metal bookcase between our bedrooms, and it had a shelf on it about halfway up, and we kept this stack right on it between our bedrooms where we could each grab whatever we wanted to read whenever we did. This was our stack. And that's when my friend Mike noticed it and said, "Oh my God, you have this huge collection of comic books." And he borrowed them, he read them all in a week, brought them back, and started collecting himself. And that is what spawned the idea in my mind of collections being a thing, collecting things being something you could do, and that I already had a collection of something, and it was important. It was important to someone who was important to me and that I looked up to and wanted to emulate. And so I was like, whoa, this is a thing, and I like it. But it would take until October before I got my next issues. So G.I. Joe 43, Power Man and Iron Fist 121, The Uncanny X-Men 201. This is me riding my bike up to the 7-Eleven, which was 1.2 miles from the house. You can see here Secret Wars 2 continues in this issue. This is my second Secret Wars 2 crossover comic. This is the first one. And in this one, you can see the Beyonder. I took a real liking to the Beyonder. I have gone on to collect every appearance the Beyonder has ever made. Also, Power Man and Iron Fist. I really took a liking to them. I collected every single Power Man and Iron Fist comic. Here you can see 2 autographs. Well, this issue is the first appearance of Cable when he was Cyclops' son, Nathan, before he grew old and then came back in time as Cable. And this here, G.I. Joe 43, this is the first comic I remember someone in my class also bringing to school one day, and I was like, oh wow, other people get comics too. This is pretty cool. Now, this was the month of my brother's 13th birthday. He did not get comics anymore. He was not getting toys anymore. I was spending my money on G.I. Joe, some Transformers, Mad magazines, Cracked magazines, Dungeons and Dragons. My brother was getting a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons, and the new Muscle figures. But my brother was pretty much out. He was now a teenager. I wonder what he was doing. Oh, you know what? He really got into computers at that time. We had a Commodore 64. He really got into it. I didn't. He never looked back. He's still into computers to this day. And in December of 1985, I got The Amazing Spider-Man 274. Secret Wars 2 continues in this issue. My continuing love of the Beyonder as he battles Mephisto. This was my introduction to Mephisto. And G.I. Joe issue 45. But that's not all, because, for Christmas of that year, I got a basketball hoop, which I asked for, and I was out in the driveway shooting hoops, and my dad came home from 7-Eleven. He brought me these 2 issues of Marvel Tales starring Spider-Man. These are reprint books of early 1960s stories of Spider-Man in Marvel Tales. Now, this one was at the spinner rack back in October when I went earlier. I didn't pick it up. It was still sitting there with this next issue, 185. Not really the next issue. There's a gap in here. And my dad brought these both home to me, handed them to me while I was out there shooting hoops. You know, I think about that basketball hoop. For whatever reason, I mean, I'm not good at sports, never have been, and not very athletic, but I just wanted to play basketball. I guess, by myself. I didn't play with anyone else. Just shooting hoops, bouncing the ball. And a few years later, when I was a young father of 21 and renting a house for our small family, I bought a basketball hoop, put it out at the street, and I would just, enjoy that thing. Took it around with me through a few moves and eventually stopped using that. And there was some time period there where I would sneak onto school playgrounds and, play basketball by myself. But now that I think of it, I don't think I've touched a basketball in 25 years. Then in April of 1986, around my 12th birthday, I got The Avengers 269, G.I. Joe 49, Power Man and Iron Fist 124. The next issue would be the last. And Uncanny X-Men 207. Look at that cool one with an iconic picture of Wolverine. Then in June, the Marvel Superheroes role-playing advanced set came out, a new role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons, but about Marvel superheroes. And that summer, my friend Mike got the game, and we were playing. We had to make characters, and he drew my character for me, helped me write up his history and name him and everything. That was Mesmeron. Here is that original drawing that he made, and this is my handwriting. Back of the page. The reason why I have these comics out is because Mike had the entire run of the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. Now I have every issue, and he used these in order to help him draw the Marvel superheroes. He used the body of Mr. Fantastic and the hood and cape of Moon Knight, as well as Moon Knight's backstory to create Mesmeron. See, Mr. Fantastic, and then the hood, cape. There it is right there. Yep, Mark Spector, stepbrother, alias Moon Knight. But that's not all. We were also playing this other role-playing game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness. This is the first bit of merchandising for the new comic that had come out. This is years before the cartoon series and the toys that made it into a children's property, which I've covered in another video. I got mine signed by creator Kevin Eastman. This is the longest I've ever stood in a line. I was in line for 7 hours to get this autograph and my picture with Kevin Eastman. Anyways, we were playing this game as well, and Mike helped me create and draw my character for this game. And here he is, Steel Grip Clucky. This is Mike's drawing. He also named the character, which, I found out later was based on a comic that was coming out at the time called Steel Grip Starkey, which I now have every issue of. But check this out. My drawing of him, too. I tried it, too. Look at that. And you see the smiley face with the bullet holes through it? I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what the thing on the shoulder was. Mike said, look, this is a pack of cigarettes rolled up in the sleeve. I didn't know why would someone do that? My mom was the only smoker I knew. She didn't roll a pack in her sleeve. He's an older kid. He knew better than me. He was more worldly. And this, well, he must have been reading Watchmen, which had the smiley face with the bullet hole in it and the drip of blood. He one-upped it by just making an array of bullet holes in it. So I copied that. Now, that gun and those feet, Mike drew those for me. I couldn't do it. I tried. Swapped the side of his face for the cigarette. I guess so that you could see the smoke unobscured. There you go. Steel Grip Clucky. And then in July, Marvel introduced the New Universe, a whole new line of comics for the 25th anniversary of Marvel. And Mike was getting every issue. And believe it or not, this sucked my brother back into comics. And he got these. Starbrand issue 1, which I got 2 signatures on. Mark Hazard Merc, which I got signed as well. Night Mask, which I also got signed. Cyforce, which I got 2 autographs on. And Justice. No autographs. But I have since gone on to get every single issue of every single line of the entire New Universe from beginning to end. My brother was only in it for a few months, and then he petered out, and it ended up not being a very well-liked or remembered time period for Marvel, but I think it's cool. And then in September, I went to my regular 7-Eleven for comics, but this was the first time I ever went there with my friend Mike. And now I got Iron Man 213 and The Amazing Spider-Man 284. You can see I got 2 signatures on this. These were the first issues to where I started collecting every issue from here on out for years. Right here, this was big time. This is also a big day. I got a bunch of comics this day. I got Defenders of the Earth issue 1. You can see I got it signed. ElfQuest issue 18. So this is a subsidiary of Marvel, the Star Comics line. This was by independent creators Wendy and Richard Pinney with their ElfQuest line. They retained the rights. This was a new thing for Marvel, so it was under Epic Comics. And you got Classic X-Men number 4. This is another reprint series of older issues of X-Men. I also got G.I. Joe Order of Battle issue 2. I didn't have issue 1, but Mike did, and he said, this is cool, you got to get this. So I did, and I love G.I. Joe. And look, look, G.I. Joe and the Transformers issue 1. Pretty cool, right? Crossover, both toy lines put out by the same company. They both cartoons animated by the same company, both comic series by the same company. Now you got the crossover. And this one, Mike bought me. The Nom, issue 1. I didn't grab it. I didn't even think of it. Mike had it. He had just gotten it like the day before, whatever it was, and said, this is really cool. I want you to have it. He got it for me. You can see I've gotten it signed twice. Michael Golden, Larry Hama. While I was standing in line at the 7-Eleven, Mike in front of me behind him, and I'm holding this, the guy behind me is looking over my shoulder at it, and he goes, the Nom. I was in the Nom. I want you to have something. And he gave me his POW bracelet off his wrist, which he had had since Vietnam. I had no idea what a POW bracelet was, didn't know what POW stood for at the time. And I kept that bracelet for years, and it got misplaced in a move. But it was at this time that my friend Mark noticed my comic collection, my burgeoning collection, and he was like, oh, I got to start doing that. And he started collecting comics. He collected them to a much higher degree than me at the time. I swear he got every issue of everything that came out. He would go to the actual comic store to get them. He taught me about how you have to put these in bags and boards and store them all in comic boxes. And he was worried about the condition of them and the values of them and so on and so forth. That brings us to 1987. And in March, I got G.I. Joe issue 60. This was the final issue that I had gotten. I now have the complete run and the Nom number 7. And the following month, when I turned 13, Silver Surfer launched a new series. Here's issue 1. I got it, and I would collect it every month for 83 consecutive issues. Now, I was going to the store every week at this point and getting comics because, like I said earlier, I was now collecting every issue of Amazing Spider-Man and Iron Man. And now I'm adding to that the Silver Surfer. It was at this time my future friend Sean, who I hadn't met yet, he was out there in the world collecting comics as well. He had stuff going back to that first appearance of the Hobgoblin and Amazing Spider-Man, but during this period of time, he was collecting stuff that I didn't even know existed, like Boris the Bear, Wild Dog, Fallen Angels, Judge Dredd in 2000 AD comics from the UK, The New Mutants. He was getting John Byrne's She-Hulk run, where she's breaking the fourth wall that years and years later became popularized by Deadpool. And he was getting detective comics with Batman and Man of Steel with Superman, another John Byrne revamp of a character. So he was over on the DC end of the world, as well as the Independence comics world. Like he was getting Cerebus. And as that summer began, I told my friend Mike, you know what, when I grow up, I'm going to draw Spider-Man. I'm going to work for Marvel Comics. And he said, hey, I'm going to be working for TSR, working on Dungeons and Dragons. I don't care if I have to start sweeping the floors, whatever it takes. I'm going to be working there. But by the end of that summer, my parents had divorced. Mike had died. We sold most of our stuff, moved out of town, away from all the kids I ever knew, and moved to the next town. Later, in November of 1987, I got Amazing Spider-Man issue 298. Of course, I was getting it every month. Didn't think anything of this. Didn't realize this was the debut of Todd McFarlane, a guy who I would soon become absolutely obsessed with, collecting everything he put out, copying line for line everything he did, reading every interview, hanging on his every word and wanting to become him. And I also got the final issue of ElfQuest. Then in January of 1988, the new year kicked off with Spider-Man issue 300. And this is when my friend Mark called me and he said, are you getting Spider-Man? Do you realize this artist, Todd McFarlane, is like the hottest guy in all of comics? Now remember, I said Mark was actually going out to the comic stores. He was on the pulse. He was getting comics buyer's guide. He knew what was hot and what was not. And I was still just getting stuff off the spinner rack at 7-Eleven. But I said, yes, I got it. And he goes, do you have issue 298 where he debuted? Yes, I've got that. And he goes, well, you need to start taking care of these comics because this guy, Todd McFarlane, he is it. And I was like, oh, wow. And that was the first time I actually started just analyzing a specific artist's art style. Hadn't thought of it before. I noticed that Jeff Dee's art from Dungeons and Dragons and like Deities and Demigods from the Elric of Melnibone, Mythos, and what have you had jumped out at me as something really cool, and I wanted to copy that. But I didn't really think about Jeff D or obsess over Jeff D, and I didn't really think of artists or if I liked an artist in comics or not. It hadn't dawned on me. But after that phone call with Mark, it's crazy to think of. I mean, here I am. I'd already decided I wanted to draw comics for a living. I was already obsessively drawing comic book stuff constantly. And here it was, somebody else had to clue me in on, hey, do you like the difference between artists and their styles? Very weird to think about. But it was that summer in June when I met my friend Sean. I met him. He lived in a house right next to the apartments I lived in. I've made a whole video about this. I went away to Italy for 6 weeks, and then I came back a week into the school year, high school. That was kind of a mess, but then I started to, settle in and realized that Sean and I had a lot of things in common. We had comics in common. We liked drawing. We liked playing Dungeons and Dragons. He had a whole collection of the lead miniatures and taught me how to paint them. We went and started taking karate together years later. We had a lot of things in common. Pretty much did everything together for quite a number of years. Now, he was getting different comics than I was. So he was getting Batman. He was getting the Death in the Family and the Cult. And he was getting Punisher War Journal, drawn by a then unknown Jim Lee. But since he was older and he had a car, he started taking me to the Record Trader comic store. This is the comic store that Mark went to. And Mike and some of the older kids, they also would go to the comic store. This was August of 1988 when I got to go with Sean and got to actually look around, spend some time there. Now, I had been to the comic store once before, a little bit earlier in the year. I convinced my dad to take me there. I think on one of the bi-weekendly visitations he was court-ordered to do. And that's where I got to meet the store owner, Chet, who I had heard stories about from the older kids and from Mark. And years later, I would actually work with Chet because he was not at the Record Trader very much longer. By the time I went back a few months later, he was already gone, and the guy that was working for him, Ralph, had taken over the store, and he's still there to this day. All these decades later, he's still there. Now, like I said, I would work with Chet years later at Domino's Pizza. That is a story for another video. Actually, okay, I'm going to hold a lot of stories because there are way too many tangents. But just speaking of that earlier time when I went with my dad, I got to see my dad have a conversation with Chet, asking him, how do you remember, what issue this came out in and yada, yada, yada. And Chet was like, well, what do you do for a living? And, well, I'm sure you remembered what color ink to put in the printer for this or that. It was a goofy conversation, right? But I do remember my dad pointing on the wall and saying, oh, wow, I had that as a kid. It was an issue of The Flash from the early 60s. And if I see the cover, I think I could remember exactly what it was. What I do remember is it had a $30 price tag on it. Now, this is 1988, so adjust that for inflation. Think of how little money I made back then as a kid, getting an allowance. I thought this was the most expensive comic in the world. What happened to your comics? Why don't you have this? We could be rich. And he's like, oh, my parents threw all that stuff out. And I was like, well, what was your oldest issue? Did you have this? Did you? And he said, look, we didn't know what issues were. We didn't go by the numbers. We just knew what the stories were. And we didn't keep them in good condition. You roll them up, you stick them in your back pocket, you rip off the covers, you trade them with friends. It didn't matter. Well, while I was thinking about recording this video over the past week, I was thinking, it would be really fun to get a collection of those Flash comics from that time period where he introduced the Silver Age of comics when his new incarnation of Barry Allen was introduced in Showcase issue 4 in 1958 and kind of ran all the way for like 5 years until he had a crossover issue with the Golden Age Flash with the metal helmet with the wings on it and stuff like that. And I was like, well, I would love a collection of those issues and read that whole era. And inside that collection, I bet would be that comic that my dad pointed at, which I think maybe had the Mirror Master on the cover, a giant mirror. I remember a giant mirror. Anyways, it was that day, New Comic Book Day. This week, I went to the comic store and look what they had. DC Finest, The Flash, The Human Thunderbolt, trade paperback collection, every issue from 1956, Showcase issue 4, the debut of the Silver Age, to 1961, that crossover of the Silver Age Flash and the Golden Age Flash, Flash of Two Worlds. Every single one of those comics here in color. It was sitting right at the comic store as I was imagining how cool it would be to have something like this. It came out and was sitting there waiting for me. They only had one. It was sitting on the shelf. No one had ordered it. It was just the store owner just ordered one, threw it on the shelf. Can you believe it? Kind of a coincidence. Here it is. This is it. The Mirror Master, the giant mirror. You are seeing in real time. Look, goosebumps. This was the comic. Well, I bet it ain't $30 now. That was what, 35, 40 years ago? Oh my gosh. Then in December of 1988, I would start my first pull service at the Record Trader with Amazing Spider-Man 313, Silver Surfer 22, and Iron Man 241, the 3 comics I was getting every week or every month or whatever it was at 7-Eleven. Now, I didn't have to worry about it. They were pulled for me and saved. And as you can see, no more UPC symbols. They're not being rung up at a 7-Eleven register. This is the direct market. And with the Todd McFarlane issues, he would draw a unique picture for each issue. Now, I'm calling it the Record Trader, but actually it's officially called the Record Trader 1. Don't know why, and there's no Record Trader 2. It started off as a booth at the flea market. It was Chet. He sold comics, and he teamed up with Ralph, who sold records. And then when they opened the store, it sold records and comics, and they still sell records and comics. Speaking of which, one of the things that Ralph would do is he would take, if you didn't have a record, he had it in his collection for $6. He would make a cassette tape copy of it for you. And about 10 years later, in the 90s, I took my old Christmas albums that are now 50 years old, and they were obscure albums. They were never put on CD. I took them to Ralph, and I had him burn them onto CD for me. And I just drove my mom to my daughter's place in Altamont Springs. It was a 3.5-hour drive, and we listened to all 6 of those albums from beginning to end. It timed it perfectly. I hit play when we left the driveway, and as I pulled into the parking spot to shut off the car, it finished the final song on the 6th album, which I'm only able to listen to, on the phone, Bluetooth through my car speakers, my iPhone, because of Ralph getting those off the vinyl albums for me, taking out all the pops and clicks and stuff that, are on vinyl records, made them nice CD quality. And it was at this time that my brother would take his final toe dip into childhood. He got the Havoc and Wolverine Meltdown series. These are square-bound, painted, watercolor painted comics. He got these, really cool, and he got that first set of Star Trek The Next Generation action figures from Galoob. That was it, just a little toe dip in the water, and then he went off to the Army. It was during Desert Shield, before Desert Storm, went into the Army, boot camp, all of that training stuff, and then Desert Storm happens. He doesn't go to the front lines. They station him in Germany. He's in communications. I've made a video about the postcards he would send back to me. I showed all that stuff. That's where he met his wife. That's where he started having kids, and he's never been a child again. Now, in 1989, I would collect a ton of comics. The Batman Spider-Man movie came out. The New Universe line of comics came to an end, and Todd McFarlane would end his run on The Amazing Spider-Man, but he would return writing and drawing his own Spider-Man series with this issue number 1 from 1990. Look, signed. And we would see the next new hot artist of the day taking over the world with his comics. Rob Liefeld would debut his new character, Cable, who kind of went by the wayside and just a random villain in the series, would later become the most popular thing, Deadpool. Now Cable is just kind of like a spin-off character from Deadpool. But anyways, started in the New Mutants, and this was the final issue 100, which was the first issue that I got. My friend Sean was getting the ones leading up to it. New Mutants was an obscure title no one was getting, except for people like Sean, who was getting stuff off the beaten path. And that's why Rob Liefeld was able to just change everything and become this powerhouse. And so issue 100 was a big seller, and I got mine signed by Rob Liefeld when I met him, and the writer Fabian Nicieza to Kevin. This would be the final issue, as you can see, and then it was relaunched as X-Force. It was also in this year that Namor got a new series, starting with issue 1, where I would then collect every issue that came out after that. And over at DC, Simon Bisley was making waves with Lobo. But that's not all. Now it was my turn to get the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. This is the Master Edition. Now, like I showed earlier, Mike had that original run that came out and was using those to learn how to draw the Marvel superheroes. Well, now I was a burgeoning artist wanting to learn, and they were putting all of the Marvel Universe out again, but there were so many new characters and so many new updates. Now, these came out as 3-ring binder punch-out pages in shrink wrap, pack after pack after pack. There was a million of them. I got them all. I no longer have them, but they have reprinted them all in these giant trade paperbacks, multiple volumes. I have all of the volumes. I just want to show you this first one because every single character in every one of them was all drawn by Keith Pollard. And I met Keith Pollard and I had him sign this because I actually drew every one of them myself. I still have all of the drawings. They're down the hall in the next room, giant stack of typing paper, copier paper, computer paper, whatever you want to call it. Now, these reprints, they're black and white, and it's phone book paper. The original versions that I drew from were cardstock, full color, and I drew front, side, and back of every single Marvel character. So I guess you could say I've copied Keith Pollard's art more than I've copied anyone else's. And 1991 was another huge year. First, we got Marvel Comics Presents Barry Windsor Smith introducing the Weapon X storyline. See this image? I have this on a shirt now that my daughter gave me. In Namor, issue 8, they brought back Danny Rand, Iron Fist, who had been gone for years because he died in the final issue of Power Man and Iron Fist, issue 125. Years earlier. They bring him back. Starting in this comic, he's been back ever since. And over here in Silver Surfer, which I was getting every month, issue 34, they bring back this character, Thanos. Had actually been gone for years and years and years. This is where they bring him back. He did not leave. This eventually evolved into the Infinity Gem storyline, Infinity Stones, the Infinity Gauntlet. All of that came out of the Silver Surfer comic. All those characters, Drax the Destroyer, every one of them that you see in Guardians of the Galaxy, all the storylines in the Marvel movies with the Infinity Gauntlet and the stones and all of that stuff, it all starts here. A first issue of a new era of greatness. Then we've got Uncanny X-Men 275, which I'm at this point now getting every issue of. This is the one where I take notice of Jim Lee. And then Wolverine issue 41, another comic I was getting every month. This is where I took notice of Mark Silvestri. And over here, Marvel Comics Presents 85, I take notice of Sam Keith. These are all artists, the ones that would launch launch Image Comics. I got this one signed. It's not by Sam Keith. I've unfortunately never been able to meet him. It's by writer Peter David. And then Jim Lee's debut in X-Men issue 1, a new series just specifically for him. This was the biggest selling comic of all time. And then this new Wizard magazine, issue 1, cover by Todd McFarlane. He had already vacated his own Spider-Man series that they had given him, and we would not see him again until the launch of Image Comics. And then Uncanny X-Men 282, where I would notice Whilce Portacio, which I got him to sign it when I met him, and I told him he was my favorite artist at Image. Even though he really didn't get to come out with this Image Comics, because if you, maybe you don't know the story, but yes, when he was on Uncanny X-Men, he was now my new favorite artist, and he was the one I was most excited about for his comic debut, Wetworks, at Image. But his comic, it was delayed. He ended up dropping out of comics altogether. His sister had died. He had personal things. He was gone. He even kind of unbecame one of the original 7 founders of Image. They've now kind of retroactively replaced him with Robert Kirkman from The Walking Dead and pretend he is a founder of the company, even though Robert Kirkman is younger than me and was a child when. Anyways, I'm not going to get into all that. But now we start 1992. Now this is the year I graduate. I'm the class of 92, but I was already graduated from high school. I only had to take the first semester of 12th grade. So when Christmas break started at the end of 91, I was done with school. By the time the break was over and the new year began, I never went back to school. In fact, I was, believe it or not, now working as a professional artist, and I actually drew a comic. This was for the company Sunken Treasure, and we've got Namor issue 26. This is where, even though I don't care for this cover, there are covers that came out later and interior art much better. This is where I discovered Jay Lee, got him to sign it when I met him. I still remember every word of his interviews at the time, his 18-hour days, his use of the airbrush. Okay, now we've got Incredible Hulk 393. This is where I discovered Dale Keown. My dad liked this cover because, my dad was a printer, and he's like, look at that, the metallic green ink. That's a lot of money. These Hulk comics would have a lot of gimmicks. I mean, there was a Pepto-Bismol kind of glow-in-the-dark pink cover that my dad took notice of. There was Fantastic Four ones that had the embossed cover with the die cuts and all. My dad was into those types of things. And over here in Wolverine issue 65, I notice artist Mark Texiera, which I got him to sign it. And here's another autograph, must be the writer. I could not get enough of these cool artists. This is like the biggest time in comics, the greatest influx of the most varied talents in the world. And then Rob Liefeld debuts Youngblood, issue 1. This is the launch of Image Comics. Look, 2 different covers. The only difference is this part is purple and here it's orange. It's the only difference. They're not different printings. They're both first printings. That was followed by Todd McFarlane's Spawn, issue 1, Eric Larson's The Savage Dragon, issue 1, and Jim Lee's Wildcats, issue 1. And that was followed by Mark Silvestri's Cyberforce, issue 1, which I got him to sign, Whilce Portacio's Wetworks, issue 1, which I got him to sign, and Jim Valentino's Shadowhawk. Jim Valentino is actually the first guy I ever met at a comic book convention 15 years ago. And no, I didn't get him to sign this. And I told the story of my meeting with Jim Valentino on it was a video exclusive for Patreon supporters back when I had a Patreon about 7-8 years ago. I may tell that story again, but not now, not here. And of course, the death of Superman. I believe this is Superman 75. It's still sealed in its black bag. Yes, Superman 75. This year, 1992, I was now living in the next town over, a town that I am still living till this day, 32 years later and counting. And I told the story about getting this comic at the new store I had my pull service at in one of my Superman videos. And and my brother was friends from high school with the store owner of this comic store. And actually, I collaborated with him on a comic that we were going to put out through his store that never did come out. I've shown some of that art on one of those old Patreon videos. I'll have to bring all that stuff out again at some point and make a new video about those days. And that brings us to 1993. We've got Dale Keown coming out with his Image comic, Pit. Sam Keith coming out with his Image comic, The Max. Keith Giffen, who had taken over from Simon Bisley on the Lobo comics with his Image comic, Trencher. And Sergio Aragones from Mad Magazine fame came out with an Image comic, The Mighty Magnor. I know it doesn't show Image, but that is the letter I. And when Image Comics launched, they were published through Malibu Comics, and then Image bought Malibu. And that's when things came to an end. You see, everybody that had made comics exciting had now banded together and left all of the really fun books and started their own company, became overnight multi-millionaires many times over, and stopped putting out comics. Left behind was Marvel and DC just kind of scrambling, and they're putting out gimmick comics covers like this with the metallic gold, and too many crossovers like Infinity Crusade, which is like the 50th Infinity Gauntlet just storyline crossing over through everything. And Wizard Comics was putting out special issues, and there was just, they call it the speculator boom, where people that weren't collecting comics now were buying multiple issues of everything to flip them as an investment. They were coming over from sports cards, whatever. The whole industry collapsed. Everybody you liked was off of all the fun books. The books that they were now putting out weren't good, and they stopped putting them out. Then eventually they would hand them over to new people that you didn't care about. Those weren't the people that you were following. Now all those creators were rich businessmen, and they were not going to be sitting at a drawing table 18 hours a day. They were done. They were rich. And that was it. And I had personal things going on in my life at the time. Don't need to get into in this video, but pretty much I ended up stopping everything. And these are the final issues that I got at my pull service. These are the final comics I got for years. I even stopped drawing for a while. Amazing Spider-Man 375, Namor 38. So this is a cover that I'm trying to talk about that was really cool. I had to get Jay Lee to sign this because that other one I showed you was kind of junk. This is the stuff that was cool. And Silver Surfer issue 3. Now at this point I had all 83 issues, but I said, I'm done. Here we go. This is it. This is where it ends. 1980 to 1993. That was until 39 months later, in September of 1996, I'm standing in line at 7-Eleven, and there's the spinner rack. This must have been the end of the spinner rack, because they have not existed for years. But there were the first issues of my characters. Iron Man, Fantastic Four. I loved Captain America when I was like 4 or 5 years old from the TV movies, and Avengers. But better than that, it's the guys from Image. They're back. This is Jim Lee on Fantastic Four. This is Rob Liefeld. This is Will Sportatio on Iron Man, and the Hulk is in there too. I got him to sign it. And then Jim Lee with Jim Valentino over here on the Avengers. And I grabbed them all. I'm like, I'm back. They're back. We're back. It's on. Didn't last. A few months later, Rob Liefeld was fired. Jim Lee took over everything. The comics weren't great. And that was it. I was out again, and that time for good. In 1998, I started selling my comics on eBay. Some of them sold. And that was it. I bought some of them back. Some of them I can't afford to buy back. But most of them didn't sell. I found out that most comics are valueless. And it's only gotten worse. But that didn't matter. I just lugged around my comic boxes from move to move and kept them in storage and never really thought about it. I couldn't get rid of them. I needed money. Didn't want to sell them. I mean, I did want to sell them. No one wanted to buy them. I didn't want to throw them away. But that's the way it stayed for 17 years until May 2nd, 2015, when I went to my first free comic book day. This is the first time I'd ever heard of it. I heard about it on the radio in my car, driving around, probably to or from work. And I said, what is free comic book day? I'm interested. I'm intrigued. Let me find a comic store. Let me go figure out what this is all about. And this is the first comic I grabbed, The Phantom. And this is where it all started. This is actually the first video ever on my YouTube channel from 2015, and I have not stopped getting comics since then. We're at 9.5 years so far. I've got 25 long comic boxes full of these comics bagged and boarded. That's like 300 comics per box. I have 3 of the shorter boxes full. I have magazine boxes. It's insane. I get them off eBay. I went back to the Record Trader. I have the new comic store I go to every week that I've had a pull service at for a year or so. Now, I just get what I want to read, and I fill in the spots of old stuff. I do get new comics. I wish I could read a lot more of them. I'm like Burgess Meredith in The Twilight Zone. I just wish I had the time to read, and I don't. None of us have the time to do the things that we want to do. None of the comics I get are expensive. I've never spent more than $150 on a single issue of anything. Most comics I get are $5 or less, except the new comics. Sometimes those are $8, $10, $9, $10, whatever it is. I get collections. Those are like $25 for $50 for a collection. I have gotten a $100 book here or there. They're collections of stuff, but none of them are expensive. I don't get those slabbed collector things. These are not to sell. When I do get them signed, I try and get them to sign my name on it. They're not for resale. So now I have a gigantic collection of valueless things that you can't turn over to anything but a dumpster, but I love them. I just wish I could get the time to read them. Maybe one day I'll stop getting them. I would like to. I'd like to just stop and catch up on what I have. Maybe fill in some more of the spots if that's possible, but I still feel the excitement of the new comics coming out. I like going up to the comic store every Tuesday and seeing what they have for me, and then getting the previews catalog and seeing what's coming out and what I want saved. So we'll see where this goes. I hope it goes in a good direction. Until next time.